who will be moderating our panel, who is a program officer at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation of Battle Creek, Michigan. In this role, Dr. Sargent is responsible for leadership and vision in program conceptualization, planning, management, evaluation, policy, and learning for statewide programs in Michigan. So join me in welcoming Dr. Sargent and our wonderful panel.
Thank you, Sarah. Is the mic working? It is. It's working well. I was just thinking as I listened to Sarah give that wonderful introduction of me, how happy my family would be, like Dr. Sargent. It's like, I've got to record that and just see how that works sometimes. This afternoon, we're going to have a fabulous panel. You've worked with many of the panelists this morning in the breakout sessions, and we heard from the early morning keynote speaker, and I'm just going to take a moment to reintroduce them to you as we share experiences about moving beyond bias in our communities around a variety of issue areas. So I'm going to start with introducing, down over here to my left, Mr. Shaun Harper, or Professor Shaun Harper, who's a tenured faculty member in the Graduate School of Education, Africana Studies, and Gender Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the executive director of the Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education. Next, we have Maggie Potapchuk, right here to my left. Maggie's a good friend and the founder of MP Associates, a consulting practice that works in partnership with individuals, organizations, communities to build capacity and facilitate change to collectively achieve racial justice. Next, we have Paul Doyle, right here to my right, the founder and the CEO of Inclusive Performance Strategies, and he brings to us 30 years of management experience to help organizations embrace change and diversity and service environments around a variety of health sectors. Next, I feel like I'm really echoing.
So great.
I do, okay. So next, thank you. I'm gonna record that for my family too. Next we have Julie Nelson, the Director of the Government Alliance for Race and Equity, and she's also a Senior Fellow at the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at the University of California, Berkeley. Julie is a former Director of the Seattle Office for Civil Rights. We have Rachel Godsil, who was our earlier morning keynote speaker. She is the Director of the Perception Institute, and she is also the Eleanor Bontachu Professor of Law at Seton Hall University Law School. We also have, finally, but not least, Michael Ramirez, who's the Senior Vice President of People, Places, and Administration at Herman Miller. He's formerly served as the Vice President of Inclusiveness and Diversity there. So what we're going to do is we're just going to start with some questions to our panelists. We're going to have a dynamic session here where they get a chance to talk a little bit about their work and then exchange amongst each other. I'm going to start by asking a question to Shaun, and that is, what are some of the challenges that you're finding that get in the way of moving towards racial equity, and how is implicit bias manifested in education?
Sure. Before I answer, I would like to thank you all for spending the day here with us, having such an important conversation and doing such important work for your community, for Michigan, and our nation. If we could have more people to do what we're doing here today, I think that would move us several steps forward. Certainly, I think that consciousness raising is a necessary first step, right? That if we could raise the consciousness of our nation around the realities of race and racial inequities and racial injustice and so on, that knowing better might in fact compel some of us to do better. We obviously can't stop there, though. There has to be, a really aggressive strategy to dismantle, systems that cyclically reproduce bias. I know that we've been talking a whole lot today about implicit bias, like on an individual level, but we should also think about how systems and structures themselves are also biased. And I just think that like not having a collective sort of consciousness about the ways that bias shows up individually and systemically continues to be like a major barrier. There's another part to your question.
The other part to my question, what have been some of the impacts of your work and the inequity you see also?
Oh, sure. So my work has been largely focused, in fact, on creating a new narrative and a counter-narrative about young men of color, particularly Black and Latino boys, because there are these like very hopeless, deficit, criminalized notions of who these young men are. And, I argue, quite squarely that it is that one-sided mischaracterization that leads to bias in policing, that led to the murders of Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis and scores of other, young Black and brown boys who didn't deserve to die, right? That, when the nation only reads about and hears, nothing but bad news about, particular communities, that affects the way that we teach members of those groups and those communities. It affects the way we police, those groups and those communities. The ways that we, as Rachel so brilliantly pointed out in her keynote this morning, the ways in which we evaluate applications for employment with people who have names that sound like they might be one of these people, right? So I think that the consequences are just so enormous. And, I would love to see our nation move ahead on these issues.
Thank you, Shaun. Next, we're going to ask Paul to answer that same question with respect to the health sector. What are some of the challenges you're finding in your sector, and how has implicit bias been manifested in some of the things you see?
Well, and Shaun did a great job of pretty much laying it out there for any industry or any area. I think that's transferable. As far as moving towards racial equity, there's been a lot of headway, a lot of good effort, a lot of work that has been done. I think that the challenge for healthcare is how do you move this to be the level of strategic or the burning platform, so to speak, that moves healthcare like any other issue. And I think we've done a good job of starting to look at data, but we still have a ways to go to understand how to turn a lot of the data that needs to be stratified by demographics into meaningful use that can show us how this is really impacting our ability to move towards racial equity. In regards to implicit bias and how that is either manifested is like anything else, lack of knowledge or lack of education to be aware of how this is coming into play in the healthcare arena is a key area that we still have a lot of work to do in. I shared some information within the breakout around research and projects that have been done, but we still have a lot of work to do in that area to bring us how this is impacting our ability to deliver quality care equitably across all groups, and how it's impacting the provider or clinician and patient encounter, and hampering the ability to foster patient-centered care. I could tell you by teaching, I've been teaching in the Michigan State College of Human Medicine for now going on 6 years, and we have now been able to start to infuse the education around implicit bias into the curriculums. So that's kind of taking care of some of our front door. But from a historical standpoint, that's going to take time to manifest, into a positive impact within the healthcare arena. But like any other industry, you don't know what you don't know. Mm-hmm. And I always keep saying, in God we trust, but all else bring data. And so we have to be willing to, be transparent, and I think that's another big challenge, is to what level of transparency are we willing to be around this issue.
Okay, thank you. Earlier this morning, when Rachel talked with us a little bit about many of these issues, actually, she touched upon an issue around debiasing. So I wanted you to explore that a little bit more and talk to us more about what can be done at the individual and institutional level to reduce implicit bias and promote equity. What are some of the best practices out there that you're seeing?
So some of the most exciting work is being done still within research labs, and the University of Wisconsin's Patricia Devine has done some incredible work to actually bring together successful small efforts that other researchers have found into a set of multiple best practices and multiple steps to take to, as she calls it, break the prejudice habit. And the overarching goal of this work is to dislodge the distorted and negative stereotypes that we've been talking about and replace them with a much more complex set of humanistic images that recognize sort of full people and not negative associations and distorted stereotypes. So the beginning of the sort of four-step model that she's created is to first identify, when am I, as a person engaging in this model, when am I responding on the basis of stereotypes? So an easy example, and one that one of the young women who participated in the study described, is she was standing on campus and a black man walked by her and she flinched. And as she did it, she realized for the first time she noticed that she was responding to this young man in a way that had nothing to do with him as a person. It was based on a stereotype that was completely contrary to any reality of her being in danger. I mean, the reality, frankly, for most young women in college situations is it's people we know. It's not a stranger who just walks by us from whom we're really in danger. So this was a completely stereotyped response. And she also started to think about, how did this affect his day when he walked by and see me flinch? And so this was the beginning, to notice when we're responding on the basis of stereotypes. The next step is to begin to very consciously identify what the stereotypes are that we hold about different groups, and very consciously start to look for counter-stereotypic examples, ideally in our own communities. So ideally, sort of, if again, recognizing even all of us who want to be non-racist, we have these negative stereotypes, and thinking about what they are, again, criminalization or poverty or people who aren't focused on education, whatever these negative stereotypes are. And it's painful to even list them or think about them. But list them, think about them, identify them, and then to start to think, I mean, look at this panel, look at this room. We have a room full of counter-stereotypic examples in every ethnic, gender, identity group. And so in an ideal world, we'd have all the examples here to begin to alter these stereotypic images. So that's number two. The third step, and I talked about this a little bit this morning, is to learn to individuate. And as I discussed this morning, this is particularly hard for whites because we've been taught that to be non-racist is to be colorblind. Well, if we're colorblind, then that means we're not supposed to notice when someone's of another race. If we're not supposed to notice that someone's of another race, then that means noticing that there are specific skin color differences that they have, or different hairstyle differences, or different facial features. That feels racist. And white people are often very surprised when they're told, that's not racist, that's just knowing what I look like. But it becomes like an act of courage to really look at people and say, oh, that's okay, I'm seeing this. And like our kids can do it when they first go to school and they describe us, I'm not white, I'm kind of a weird peach color. So it's kind of like our kids use the crayon box, but we use these broad categories. So individuating and allowing us to see people both and notice that they're a member of a racial group, but see them as an individual is the next part. And then this perspective-taking empathy that I described, where it's not what would I, given my life experience, do, but rather what are the life experiences that someone who fits into a different racial or ethnic group has lived that helps me understand what it has been like. And for that young woman, for example, to think about, what would it feel like to have people respond to me that way when I walked by them? That's perspective-taking empathy. And then finally, to aggressively seek out opportunities to have interracial contact and to see those as opportunities to learn. And what's really important about this final step is, I talked about racial anxiety this morning, but if people see an interracial interaction as an opportunity to engage and to learn, and we are not focused on how am I being perceived, it's not self-oriented, it's other-oriented, that's actually been shown to reduce racial anxiety too. So it's a really powerful set of steps that can be engaged in by the individual. But at the same time, and I don't think I should take the time to answer this question, we obviously have to do much more at the systemic level, because to rely upon each person to do this on their own, that's not an effective change strategy. So this is something that we can all take away with us, but we want to have the kind of systemic, institutional, community-based conversations and the structural conversations that can lead to that sort of change, simultaneous to our efforts to alter our own practices so that we're not harming people along the way.
Thank you. And so one of the things that, Rachel, that you did earlier today is you talked about the mind science, and the mind science impacts all of us, whatever race, ethnic group we come from, across our differences. So it impacts all of us. But we're sitting right here in Ottawa County, and it is a predominantly white county. I don't think those are the kinds of communities that we imagine doing work around racial equity, just typically. And so I'm wondering if Maggie can talk to us a little bit about her experience working in predominantly white communities and what that's meant and how that has shown up.
Sure. So this past January and February, Sally Lederman from CAPD, who many of you might remember from last year's summit, and Shakti Butler with World Trust, who's a filmmaker who did Making Whiteness Visible and Cracking the Codes, and myself, came out to Battle Creek, Michigan with the Center for Diversity and Innovation. I know Jorge's in the room. And then we also were out here in Grand Haven just this past February working with an amazing group of leaders with Letta, who loved working with the staff. And how many folks were at that training? I know I saw a bunch of folks. So you can see the hands in the room, so you can ask them more questions about the training. But this was Transforming White Privilege Curriculum, which is funded by Kellogg, and it's figuring out how we can identify, talk more effectively, and intervene to address white privilege and its consequences. And I think typically when folks hear white privilege, they hear, well, you know, me as a white person walk in the store, you know, I won't be fouled, or someone won't ask for my ID when I pull out a credit card. And I'm considered an honest and law-abiding citizen. And I think part of it is providing this curriculum to be an entry point of how we can unpack the complexity of the system of inequity. So if we follow that through in terms of other ways that folks are labeled, like, or how decisions are made within policies, like who is defining what a stable family is? And then how does that play out in the child welfare system in terms of racial disproportionality, in terms of how children of color are taken from their homes more, how they're placed in foster care longer, how it takes longer for them to be adopted and to go back to their family. And part of it is around how we're defining some of those pieces, and obviously a much longer conversation. I think one of the places that I see folks also get tripped up is we got a lot of pushback for saying transforming white privilege. It's like, wait, you're saying that in mixed company? What's that about? And I have to say, you know, it was great to see in the New York Times, just this past February, there were 2 articles with white privilege in the headlines. And one was, research shows white privilege is real. And the other one was challenging white privilege from the inside, which talked about private schools that were working on white privilege with their staff and their students. So I think, you know, that's a part of, in terms of doing the work around white privilege. And Letta is now positioned, when this curriculum is finalized, for them to take it and deepen the work that's here. I think the other piece I just want to say about this momentum of white folks stepping up and stepping into this racial justice movement is I was just in Louisville, Kentucky for the 16th annual White Privilege Conference. 16th annual White Privilege Conference. It started in Pella, Iowa, which when we talk about white, that's pretty white. And it started with Dr. Eddie Moore, is the founder of it. And we had over 1,800 people there. I mean, there were educators, and folks from government, and folks from nonprofit. And the most refreshing piece about it is almost, I would say, a third of the folks that were there are under 25. Things are changing. And also at that conference was a national organization called Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is actually working to move whites into the racial justice movement by doing base building with different cities across the U.S. and how they can build the passion and the accountability with people of color in terms of moving it forward. I just want to say one more piece, if I may. Because I think one of the other things, and I want to read this stat so I have it handy, but this is from the Annie and Casey Foundation. Only 7% of the nonprofit chief executives and 18% of the nonprofit employees are people of color. Yet there are 60% of the nonprofits are serving people of color. That's an uphill battle. It's something that nonprofits need to figure out. You know, if we're going to include our values of fairness and justice and put it in our mission statement and our vision, what is the responsibility that comes with that to have substance of it? Diversity and inclusion are important, but they're not sufficient. We need to be looking at our governance. We need to be looking at how policies are created. And as we think about the demographic shift, if we want to be credible and considered integrity with the work that we do, then there comes accountability in how we each shows up. So that's doing the internal work process within that. So the one last thing that I'll say, and we talked a little bit about this in the community work, is the importance of us creating a community practice and action, which I think, Rachel, in terms of having that container in terms of the work that's being done and how that can happen.
Shaun wants to.
Yeah, I just want to quickly jump in on that stat that you read from the Casey Foundation, because immediately when you read it, it made me think about American schools. And I mentioned in my breakout this morning that 84% of teachers in K-12 schools are white, and the overwhelming majority of them are white women, but yet school children are remarkably more diverse. So we have to figure out a way, right, to better prepare white teachers. So I oftentimes find myself in conversations where people will immediately say, well, the answer to the challenge is to get more teachers of color, right? That certainly is part of it, right? That is a part of the imperative, but also part of it, though, is doing something with the white teachers, because I'm afraid that they're not going anywhere anytime soon, right? So we have to do more to more effectively prepare white teachers to teach racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse learners.
So thank you, both of you. It really takes us into the next section, because you talk about the nonprofit sector and the work that needs to be done in communities, and we have various sector representatives on board and here in the audience. One of the things that we don't seem to talk about too much as we go into community are the local governments. And so I'm just interested in what Julie can tell us about her work with local governments. That what's been exciting for you, and also what's been challenging, but what have you found that's exciting about your work with local governments?
How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
So I'll start by saying that I actually really love government. And I like to start by saying that because of the reality that there's some historical baggage of the role that government has historically played. And there's all sorts of, like, when we say government, I think that there's a whole sort of narrative that plays out around that's anti-government in nature. And so thinking about government bureaucracy versus public service. And for me, coming out of school, I did not plan to spend 23 years working for government. And in fact, if someone had told me that that's what I was going to be doing, I might have said, shoot me now. But truly, the work that the City of Seattle has had a race and social justice initiative for over 10 years now. The goal of the initiative is to achieve racial equity.
focus is on eliminating institutional and structural racism. And I know early on there was some nervousness about naming institutional racism. And for us, it was critically important that you cannot just think about racial equity or inequity from the perspective of sort of a few bad actors. That in fact, it's an institution and a structure that has been intentionally created. And it's been intentionally created over the course of a long period of time. So thinking back to the very, very beginning of the United States, that government has intentionally created and has maintained racial inequities for hundreds of years. And so thinking about governmental laws and policies, everything from who could be a citizen to who could vote, to who could own property, who was property, who could live where, whose lands were taken. All of that was done intentionally and explicitly by government. And so last century that started to change with the civil rights movement. And in fact, the organizing that was done from outside government, community organizing, with government as a target, we won lots of victories. There's a lot of things that have improved, but unfortunately, as we've all been talking about, both Rachel in the beginning and in our breakout sessions, implicit bias has taken it to a different place. I sometimes say racism is a slippery thing, where we got rid of one form of it, but we now have policies, practices, and procedures that still perpetuate inequities. And so the work that I'm doing with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, I really am excited about. My kids can think I get kind of geeked out about stuff, but it is very exciting. And I think about it from a transformative perspective, that it's not just that we need to make little changes here or there to government, but that we need to transform the very nature of government. There's three main ways that we are using things that we're doing to make that happen. Number one is normalizing conversations about race. That too frequently when race is on the table, too frequently it's not on the table, that we prefer to ignore it. When it is on the table, we're using different definitions, different understandings. So having a common framework with clear definitions around what it is that we're talking about, number one. Second thing is that we have to operationalize new behaviors. It's not just a matter of us as individuals sort of doing course corrections around sort of who, whether we're perpetuating bias, but it is about our systems and structures. And that will not happen unless we're intentional about it. So for example, things like using a racial equity tool, an active interruption to the decision-making process, so that when government, be it at the staff level or at the elected official level, we are intentionally and strategically incorporating racial equity into our decision-making processes. And then the last thing is around organizing. And I know that historically, when we have talked about organizing, it has been from the perspective of community organizing. And that needs to continue. But what we also need to expand is organizing within government. So thinking about transforming government. It's not going to happen by itself, that we have to think about the structures within government. So it's not, when I started with government, was working in human services. A lot about human services is related to racial equity, but some of my favorite stories are actually around the utilities, around Department of Transportation, things that we might not be immediately clear, like how does this relate to racial equity? It all does. And so organizing within government to actually transform it so that we are in fact a proactive force for advancing racial equity.
Thank you, Julie. That's very helpful. And so we've talked a lot about the public sector just right at this moment. And I know there was an earlier breakout led by Michael on the business sector. We are so fortunate in the state, and everywhere where I go, I'm statewide program officer for Michigan. I see business stepping up and really becoming a part of this conversation. We have a number of business leaders in the room right now. So I just want to hear a little bit from Michael about what you found to be really exciting about the work and any challenges that you've seen, but kind of what are you guys doing in the private sector?
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to see you. If you see me shifting around a lot up here, these are not our chairs. They really She's really uncomfortable. And if anybody's here from Grand Haven, they want to see me afterwards about how we can fix that, it's perfectly fine. I have been at Herman Miller and in the inclusiveness and diversity arena for many, many years, and I've seen a huge positive transition. When I first started in this arena, we were, as a business, and I can't speak for all businesses, but I can speak in general through my experience, a lot of businesses were approaching the issue of diversity and inclusion from a morals perspective, trying to teach morals in a workplace to folks who are trying to feed their kids, who are trying to put food on their table, who are trying to keep their jobs, who are trying to remain viable economically. And we had government policy, as you talked about, which created another kind of bias when you say to a group of people who are employed, I need to hire another group of people simply because I need to go after this number, right? You create another situation in the workplace that creates a bias. What I've been really thrilled to see, and a lot of it led by Ted Childs, who was IBM's Inclusion and Diversity Officer and a mentor of mine, was that we've switched that conversation to a business conversation. We have connected the importance of inclusiveness and diversity into a business discussion in a positive manner. So McKinsey just did a study that shows that companies that have diversity present in their workforce perform anywhere from 18 to 35% better than companies that do not. Companies that have senior executives of gender and diversity inclusion perform 8% better from an EBITDA perspective than companies that don't. So if you start to think about that and what it means to business, and as you talk to your employees around the importance of this, you connect it to the economic well-being of the company, their own economic well-being, and the importance of different perspective, getting to know people. As we transition into a global economy, how do we work with different cultures and different people? When you change the conversation to a you must do it, to a this is the reason why and here's the benefit, it changes the perspective of people. People are more open, they're more willing to participate. And that's what we've seen. When we've talked about the fact that when our business does well because we have inclusion, different perspective, and create solutions that our customers want and are asking for, we grow, you grow, your bonuses are better, your jobs are secure, your communities are stronger, your family's stronger. That's the what's in it for you. When we don't, the opposite is true. You have no bonuses, your raises may not exist, your job security is shaky, your communities are weaker because the tax base is lower, right? You're not as good as a community, as people, as a business without it. So that conversation, Turner, it's mattered. It's been our catalyst. It's been the thing that has gotten people to be open to the discussion. You are not trying to take something away from me. You are trying to add to me, not only as a person, but in my wallet, which we all know is a really big deal from a business perspective.
Thank you. Sure.
I like, what Mike has pointed out is very key, and I think it's really the key driver, a big key driver right now around this within our region. The work that we're doing with Talent 2025, who's really focused on how do we become a top 20 competitive region in the country by the year 2025, is very interesting, because the fact of the matter is that they realize that there is no way we're going to be able to meet that goal without being able to embrace the whole concept in the framework of inclusion. Considering how are we going to create the pipeline to utilize our very growing diverse population within our region to be equipped and have the capacity to be contributing to the workforce and to our industry so we can be competitive. We're not going to be able to recruit the talent and retain the talent, especially the highly diverse talent, into our communities until we show them that we are intentionally creating an inclusive growth environment in which everyone can come in and be part of the mix or a participating stakeholder in how this region grows and becomes viable. These are the things that we need to and will be having to focus on in order for us to meet and address this issue. We can't fake ourselves out. And I think the bottom line is that it's going to take, and the reason we're here, a lot of community culture change in order for people to feel included, to feel this is a place that they can say they can be a part of. I remember being part of a recruitment with a law firm and helping them bring diverse talent in. And the question was asked, what would make you feel that this would be a place that you can say is where you want to make your home? And the African-American gentleman said, I would have to see how you take care of me, and not me personally as a professional, because I can go and work anywhere. I need to see who I represent and who I'm representing. How do you take care of them? What opportunity, intentional opportunity, do you have established here for them to achieve a quality of life and be part of the mix and move on? So it was a wake-up call, and I think we need to understand that we can't do this all by ourselves. This is all interrelated, whether it's business, education, healthcare, and so forth. We all have to be in tandem. We all have to be able to move forward with some common goals and making sure they play into each other.
Thank you. We have a little bit of time here, so one of the things that's been striking for me as I've heard all of you talk is you talk about an inclusive community, and we certainly have difference, and we have difference that we appreciate and want to recognize. What does that mean in your work? How are you approaching different communities in an effective way? So how does your work change when you're addressing communities of color versus when you're addressing predominantly white communities? Maggie, you talked a little bit about that, but I'm wondering how it shows up in all of your sectors.
I can start. Thinking about government and the work that government does around community engagement or outreach, involvement, those sorts of things. What government has done historically has been pretty superficial, that in instances where there are requirements around some sort of public engagement process, much of government has done the minimum requirements. So have a public hearing and people come. Have you all been a part of this where you go to a government thing and you get like 2 minutes to testify on something? It's really not, if you haven't, don't bother. It's actually not that fulfilling. And oftentimes it's done at the very end and the decision's already been made. So as a part of the work that the Government Alliance on Race and Equity is doing, we are really digging deeper that having inclusive outreach, and more than just outreach, inclusive engagement is a key strategy that we're using. And it comes down to relationships, that it is not a single time public hearing, but it is about having deep relationship with community on an ongoing basis. That the historical model of being geared towards white middle-class homeowners, that's not sufficient when we're talking about a growing, diverse community. So having relationships on an ongoing basis is a really critical part of that.
I could say a little. So a couple years back, I did some research about community change initiatives focused on racial equity, and I think there was some consistent pieces of that. In terms of, one, it was a multiracial group that was coming together, not just of the key sector leaders, but trying to get beyond the usual suspects that typically show up for this work. Two, it was looking at the data. It was really saying, what is the state of racism right now within our community, and how is it showing up, and how is it showing up differently in different neighborhoods, et cetera. And part of it was really thinking through in terms of coming together to do some action teams. And what you're doing this afternoon in terms of moving it forward. But I have to say, when we just think about, predominantly people of color community, different demographics, how Ferguson is versus how Baltimore is very different. So that's why it's so important to identify the state of racism and how the decision-making, how the policies are impacting different groups. And that is part of the issue as well.
Did you want to?
So often when people hear about implicit bias in the mind sciences, the assumption is that the work is primarily important because it helps those of us who are white understand how race continues to play a role in how we behave, even if our values are non-racist. And that is a really important part of the work. But the mind sciences also offers really important insights into how people of other races and ethnicities respond to information in ways that are sometimes counterintuitive. So I spoke at a community organizers conference, and I think, I think some people were saying, like, why is she here? You know, she's the white lady who talks to other white people about white things. And my response was, I think there's some interesting research that will be helpful to the community organizers in the room whose focus, frankly, isn't on whites' attitudes or even whites' behavior, but rather it's on engaging and organizing within communities of color, because obviously engagement among people of all communities and all races and ethnicities is crucial. And so the example I gave that was from research done by someone who's part of our consortium named Ismail White at George Washington is a question of voter turnout. So I think the assumption often is by people who are in leadership positions that when we hear about disparities or disproportionalities, that will trigger moral urgency and action. And it's turned out that that often isn't the case, even within communities of color. And here's the study that Ismail White did. He was wondering what kind of message will create a moral urgency and an engagement in African American communities to get out the vote. And the first set of flyers that they sent out were sort of, whites are voting at 60%, we're voting at 30%, we've got to get our voices heard. Now that seemed like a reasonable approach to me, right? Like everyone wants their voices heard. We want, so, you know, it seems like a real problem if you have different races voting at different rates in community. And
Rachel, we're over here shaking our heads. Paul and Shaun and I are going, no, I don't think so.
Well, okay, so you guys are smarter than I was. But this was the kind of message that was going out. I mean, this is what organizers were sending out. So the next message that Ismail sent out and his team sent out to demographically similar communities was, your neighbor votes, so should you, see you at the polls. We're a community. The group, and now you're shaking your head like duh, the group who got the, you know, sort of demographic disproportionality information, the vote rate went down. Because the message that's being communicated is, what's the point? Whereas the group that got the your community votes, your neighbor votes, see you at the polls, we're a community, the idea was we're a community, we're in this together, and we're going to get out to the polls together. And so, again, obviously the two of you are far smarter than a lot of us who are doing organizing in earlier eras, but I think, again, to some extent, if you care about these issues and you hear disproportionality, often you're like, this is something we've got to change. But at the same time, we have to feel like there's hope, and that's across community. So the mind sciences, I think, can be valuable, although, again, obviously if we just had Jocelyn and Paul and Shaun here, we wouldn't need them. But the mind sciences can be helpful in sharing information about how people respond.
Can I say just one thing? I really appreciate Rachel sharing that study. And one of the things that I have felt so fortunate in being at Berkeley is greater exposure to studies and research. My experience before being with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, working in government, huge disconnect. There's data, there's research, never gets used. And so right now, the opportunity to take studies like that, there are applications to work that is being done. City of Madison, around voter turnout, actually grappling with the exact issue that Rachel just described, low voter turnout, took similar messaging to what Rachel Rachel said, but also recognize that from a poll worker perspective, that poll workers were disproportionately white. And one of the things that they knew from their community engagement was having faces that reflected yourself as a poll worker was critically important. They did a recruitment process, not just, recruitment to get people to actually just do the one election, but to organize within their community on an ongoing basis. Their numbers went up dramatically, the disproportionality that Rachel talked about. Having a concrete strategy that is actually implemented helps to change the outcomes. So thank you for, I wasn't even thinking about that, but you talking about that study, it's a good one.
Professor, I too have a question about this study, right? Like, I wonder if there were a third way, right? A third example. They're trying to take our voting rights away, our voting privileges away. There's an attack on access to the polls. I wonder what kind of behavior that would have incited.
I'm stuck between the professors.
That obviously wasn't in the one study, but it is true that for many of us, the idea of sort of an enemy, someone intentionally trying to harm our community, can incite engagement in a very powerful way. So my early work as a young lawyer was in the environmental justice movement, and that was in the late 80s, early 90s. And the idea that suddenly started becoming known to people was that polluting facilities were more likely to be located in communities of color, regardless of class. So often the idea was, well, if you're poor, this is a challenge, but if you just, earn your way up, you'll get out of these uncomfortable polluting situations. But that wasn't what the data showed. The data showed that it was race more than class, and that really galvanized people. Because there was an assumption that some in government made that environmental issues are not issues that some communities care about, it's only about jobs. But it was certainly apparent that when it became known that a hazardous waste incinerator was more likely to be located in a Black or Latino neighborhood, regardless of class, people organized, and that has changed. So there were some real victories around that issue because people became aware that this was a harm to their children, to their communities, and that was something they weren't going to accept.
Thank you. So before I move on to the last question, which is going to be kind of a speed round, I wanted to pick on Michael a little bit and just ask kind of, yes,
See, these are supposed to be scripted, and this is not on the script.
I know. I'm wondering what you do when you encounter the kind of skepticism that we've been talking about here in the communities that you work in the business sector. Like, what do you do to overcome that skepticism?
I'm not sure we have yet. I mean, I think it's a real issue and a real challenge for us, and I think it depends on which sector of the community I'm talking to. For us and what we do, the research is important. Numbers are important, data is important, but there's nothing that can replace experience in the business place. Mm-hmm. What we strive to do and what we're trying to do is create inclusive communities so that you can experience people that may not be like you. I can't continue to teach and show data to a group of homogeneous people and expect the behavior to change because they have no experience outside the paper that they're looking on. So for us, and when I talk to people in the community, we have got to do a better job of changing the way our community actually looks through outreach programs, through educational programs, through reaching out, being intentional how we hire and try to provide opportunity. We were having a conversation earlier. A lot of people focus on outcomes. Mm-hmm. I don't know what to do with an outcome other than to hit myself in the head with it. But I do know if I measure opportunity, my outcomes will change. So we're measuring opportunity. Am I providing at Herman Miller opportunity for everyone to apply and interview for positions on an equal footing? If I do that, my data tells me I will create different outcomes. If I do not do that, I'm not going to change anything. And by the way, until I create those different outcomes through opportunity, my workforce, my community isn't going to change their bias because they have nothing around them to help catalyze it. So for us, we're trying to change. I mean, this is wonderful. When I moved here 17 years ago, and if you think Pella, Iowa is white, come to its sister city, Holland, Michigan, 17 years ago, right? It's a real difficult challenge for us, but we have to change the conversation through changing the makeup. We have to tie it to the things that are important. I will go back to the importance of economics, business, and opportunity. Our communities will not survive without strong business, without strong education. If we do not provide opportunities and get the best talent, we're not going to be here. And talent comes in all packages. We have to realize that. We have to have that discussion. We have to drive that message home, or none of this will work. I can't sit up here on a panel and tell you all why it's so important until you experience it and you see it. And that's our drive.
Okay. And so I did want to just, because we're coming to the close of our time, I think I'm trying not to upset Gil and Sarah.
You don't want to do that.
No, I don't want to do that. So I do want to ask the panelists just 30-second, what one recommendation would you make to enable the individuals that are here in the room to go into their institutions and communities to affect positive change around equity? So just one 30-second.
I think I will start with the individual. We have the need to diversify our personal and professional networks. If we do not intentionally try to do that, where we can experience what Mike and everyone here is talking about, as good and as well attended as everybody is here willing to listen, if you leave here and go back to your networks, your silos, or wherever you're at, and you're just around the people who you're usually around, and maybe they're not as diverse, and I'm not trying to pinpoint anyone, but there's a level of intentional relationship building that needs to start happening, and which you need to very much so increase the diversity of your network. When I came, I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York, too. I've been here now for a little while, but I came to Michigan from Brooklyn to Big Rapids. And you want to talk about intentional relationship building, and how to really dance. That was a dance, and I remember being hired in a health system, Spectrum Health, where I was the only male African American in a managerial position in the whole system at that time. It's come a long way since then. But, some intentional relationship building to diversify networks, me intentionally engaging them, there was those questions that come along with that, Shaun, like, well, can I ask you a question? Why do you all do this or do that? And, you got to deal with that. But, I just challenge everyone, and I don't mean I need to find a minority person today program, okay? Let's not get into that, but really genuinely, how do you increase and diversify your personal and professional networks?
Thank you. Let Michael go ahead.
Yeah, that's right on. So California to Holland, Michigan. Okay, so real similar, and I'm not Dutch, so you know the end of that sentence. I will tell you, this is great that you're all here, but I'm going to give you all a bit of a challenge. So I don't know if you're sitting next to people you know or not. Don't care. It's probably better that you don't. And I know you're going to break off into some workshops, but we will not change unless we are intentional and we create an individual strategy. We create a dashboard for ourselves, and we have somebody to hold us accountable. So what I'm going to ask you to do, instead of walking out of here and saying, this is great, I went to this, see you next year, I'm going to ask you to turn to your neighbor at some point, meet that person if you don't know them, find a way to connect with them over coffee, sit down and create individual strategies for yourself with a scoreboard, with intentional actions, and to hold each other accountable to it. So that when you come back here next year, we know exactly what you have done. And you have done more than come together and talk about the problem. You've actually tried to solve the problem.
Thank you, Michael.
So I actually want to build on Michael's, really spectacular points here. The person that you turn to doesn't necessarily have to be one of the few people of color in the audience, right? We need white people working in strong partnerships and coalitions with each other to develop a strategy with high levels of intentionality and action and a dashboard for measurement and all of that. I think that is spot on. I also think that we just have to be honest. We have to be willing to, open the proverbial can of worms and deal with the worms that are inside, right? We have to be willing to ask ourselves some very important questions about our community, about ourselves, about our children and what we teach them in schools and so on. Until we do that, until we're willing to raise race questions in some authentic and honest and sometimes deeply uncomfortable ways, right? I'm just afraid that we're going to be sort of just running ourselves in circles, sort of not dealing with what's real and doing, more window dressing than, the actual kind of action that this community needs and deserves. So definitely all of what has been said so far, including some very serious and honest conversations about race.
Thank you. Maggie, do you want me to go?
So Vincent Harding, African-American historian and a speechwriter for Dr. King, said, if you don't ever walk through trouble or confront a risk or reach beyond your comfort zone, you'll never meet the other half of yourself. So my message is for the white folks in this room, have this, if it's not already, be your no turning back moment of how you can step up. And not, it's from anywhere from getting involved in organizing for legislation or changing institutional policies, but it's also just talking about it and being okay to mess up. And to not be silent. Be okay getting out there and doing it, but your silence is not pushing the envelope further, and that's what we need to do. We need to figure out how we can dig in and move forward, and we need your confidence and your will to be able to do that.
Thank you. Julie?
Yeah, the last thing I would have to say is a few comments about love. And for me, I think love has to be centered in a lot of the work that we're doing. And thinking, we've had a lot of references been made to the fact that in this area there's a relatively high white population. When it comes to white people doing the work they should be doing on racial equity, the work that we should be doing, I think sometimes we've approached it from sort of a social work mentality. So the idea is that racism is a system that hurts people of color. And I think for those of us who are white in the room, it's really important that we think a little bit more deeply than that. That the reality that we have systems and structures that are incredibly destructive, not only for people of color, but those systems and structures have actually hurt white people too. Not in the same way by any means, but when you're the how you do in life is driven by privileges that you have received, that's a system that has pretty much stripped us of our humanity. And so thinking about how we can restore that humanity, I think about it from a perspective of love. And the implicit association test, one of my favorite snippets around the IAT was an African-American woman who had just taken the test and had found out that she has a slight preference for white people. Her response to it was, and it's one of the, it happens a lot with the results of the test. This stuff is internalized in a really deep way. But her response was that she was shocked. She's like, all of my friends are black. All of my family is black. I love black people. I don't know how, this test can't be right. And, she was so sort of authentic and sincere and really grappling with what it meant. And as I listened to her, I had a big aha around sort of when I'm talking about love and the way that racism has damaged white people, that in fact, for me as a white person to say, I love white people. All of my family is white. All of my friends are white. White people are my existence. That would come across a little bit different, right? And
It's real.
Yeah, and it becomes real when we can actually have conversations around racial equity, acknowledging the deep pain that has been caused to other people, but to us as well. And that it's not just conversations. The best way to heal is actually to do the work and to do it in such a way that we're actually, Mike, I know you said you didn't like outcomes. I do like outcomes. I, give people all the opportunity they want, that And it also puts you in a place where it's like, oh, they didn't take advantage of that opportunity. I want us to have the rigor and the focus so that we know what we're doing has an impact. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Rachel, a quick recommendation.
So I don't do 30 seconds well, you'll not be surprised to hear. And since all of you heard so much from me this morning, and since it's basically between me and Reverend Herring, who I admire more than almost anyone alive, I'm actually going to say it's been a privilege and an honor. I hope everyone here has learned something from our amazing panelists. I hope you do the work. Have fun doing the work. I feel so privileged in, I think, a slightly different way than white privilege to be part of this movement. And I hope that every person in this audience has an opportunity to share that true privilege and do the work. You get to listen to Reverend Herring, and that's awesome. And thank you all so much.
Thank you. I do want to thank Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance from the Kellogg Foundation. It's been a privilege working with this amazing group, and so I am going to, with that, turn it over to Sarah and Al.